The sword didn't lose to gunpowder. It lost to steel plate. By 1350, soldiers were gripping their own blades with bare hands because swinging them had become pointless. To understand why that happened, you have to go back to a battlefield where everything still made sense. It is the 12th century. A knight stands in chainmail and a padded gambeson, maybe a partial plate at the shoulder, mostly rings of interlocked steel from neck to knee. His opponent carries an arming sword, around 32 inches of blade, tapering from a width of 2 inches at the hilt to a point designed for thrusting. Weight around 2.5 pounds, balanced close to the guard for fast recovery between cuts. Carbon content sitting between 0.5 and 0.7%, the ideal range for a blade that needs to hold an edge under repeated impact without becoming brittle. Every single one of those numbers is not a coincidence. They are answers to the specific question of how you defeat a man in chainmail. The arming sword's edge geometry was optimized to split rings, drive through padded layers, find flesh underneath. The balance point existed where it did because the fights this sword was built for required fast repositioning after each cut. The weight was what it was because the opponent it faced could be cut, and cutting required a blade that moved quickly through soft resistance. The sword and the armor it faced had co-evolved for over a century. One improved, the other responded, and the system found a kind of brutal equilibrium, not a stalemate, a conversation. Each side understood the rules of the exchange, and within those rules, the sword was exactly the right tool. Nobody on that 12th century battlefield had any reason to believe that was about to change permanently. The armorsmiths of Milan and Augsburg were about to give them one. Sometime around 1350, in those same workshops, armorers solved a problem that swordsmiths didn't know existed. They had been layering plate over chainmail for decades, adding coverage piece by piece, a breastplate here, a pauldron there. But by the mid-14th century, something crossed a threshold. The coverage became total. Steel plate over every surface that mattered, and the geometry that made a sword edge lethal against chainmail, that slight angle designed to split rings and drive through padding, now had nowhere to go. It hit a curved steel surface and skated off. The force that had been driving through resistance was now being redirected along it. The sword didn't break. It didn't fail dramatically. It just stopped delivering damage. Now imagine being the soldier who finds this out for the first time in an actual fight. You have trained with this weapon for years. You know exactly how a cut lands, exactly what it does to a man. You swing, you feel the contact, and nothing happens. You swing again. The blade rides the curve of the breastplate and goes wide. The man inside the armor is untouched, and he knows it. That moment, that specific discovery repeated across hundreds of battlefields in the second half of the 14th century is the actual death of the sword. Not a decree, not a technological announcement. A soldier swinging and feeling nothing land. The equilibrium was over, and nobody had a solution yet. The first response was the most human one. They changed how they held it. Somewhere on a 14th century battlefield, a soldier did something that would have looked insane to anyone from the century before. He reached up, grabbed his own blade with his left hand, and used the sword like a short spear, gripping steel with bare fingers to get the precision a full swing could no longer deliver, targeting the gap at the armpit, the slit at the visor, the unprotected back of the knee. Not because someone designed a technique around this, because swinging had stopped working, and this was what was left. By 1467, Hans Talhofer was documenting it in his fencing manual, not as a desperate improvisation, but as standard practice. That is the detail that matters. The time between a soldier gripping his own blade in panic and a master writing it down as the correct way to fight is the measure of how completely the sword had lost its original purpose. An entire generation of fighters had to relearn their primary weapon from scratch, not refine it, relearn it. The sword was the same object. Everything about how you used it had to change. But gripping the blade was only the first admission. The second one was worse. When half-swording wasn't enough, soldiers stopped using the blade at all. They flipped the sword upside down, gripped the blade with both hands, and swung the crossguard at the opponent's helmet like a hammer. The Mordschlag, the murder blow. This is the moment that deserves a pause. A trained soldier on a real battlefield, holding his sword by the blade, swinging the pommel at another man's skull because that was more effective than using the edge. The blade had become the handle. The handle had become the weapon. Whatever a sword was supposed to be, this was no longer it. Talhofer documents this too. not as an emergency, as a method. The sword's most fundamental identity, a blade that cuts, had been discarded in favor of using it as an improvised mace. The craftsmen watching this had only one option left. They rebuilt the sword from nothing, no cutting edge. A triangular cross-section ground to a rigid point, built entirely to find the gaps between plates and drive through them. The French called it the estoc. The Germans called it the Panzerstecher, the armor piercer. It weighed around 4 pounds, ran between 36 and 52 inches, and had a blade designed with so little cutting surface that some examples could not cut at all. The Italian master Filippo Vadi wrote that a sword should be sharp only at the tip. 3,000 years of cutting edge, abandoned in a single design instruction. This was not a sword that adapted to survive. This was a sword that had to unmake itself to remain relevant, and the craftsmen who built it knew exactly what they were admitting. They kept the name, they kept the hilt, they kept the general shape, and they removed the one thing that had always made it a sword. While swordsmiths were busy unmaking their own weapon, other craftsmen had stopped trying to save it entirely. The poleaxe emerged in the mid-14th century with no pretense of being a sword, no cutting-edge identity to protect, no 3,000-year legacy to drag along. It was built as a direct answer to a specific problem, a man inside a complete steel shell. The head combined a spike for thrusting into gaps, an axe blade for unarmored targets, and a hammer face for everything else. That hammer face is what mattered most. A blow from the hammer side of a poleaxe didn't need to penetrate plate. It transmitted force directly through the steel into the body underneath. Broken bones inside intact armor. Concussion inside an undamaged helmet. The armor that had defeated the sword was not defeated in return. It was simply made irrelevant by a weapon that never tried to cut through it at all. The warhammer followed the same logic. By 1395, French infantry were deploying sophisticated versions with thrusting tips, side flanges, and a beaked point designed to punch into plate at close range. These were not emergency adaptations. They were purpose-built instruments for a battlefield the sword no longer controlled. The sword became a sidearm, not because someone decided to demote it, because the weapons that replaced it on the armored battlefield were simply better answers to the question plate armor had asked. And all of this happened before a single reliable musket existed. The first practical flintlock mechanisms wouldn't arrive until around 1630. The sword had already been a sidearm for 150 years by then. Gunpowder didn't make the sword obsolete. It inherited an obsolescence that armor had already finished building. That inheritance is why the story gets told backwards. The real story is quieter and harder to see, because it happened in workshops and on battlefields, rather than in a single decisive moment. Two groups of craftsmen, armorsmiths, and swordsmiths locked in an escalation neither started and neither could stop. The armorsmiths solved a problem. The swordsmiths responded. The armorsmiths solved the response. The swordsmiths responded again, each time more drastic, each time giving up something more fundamental than the last. First the technique, then the orientation, then the edge itself. By the time the estoc existed, the sword had quietly confessed 3 separate times that it had lost. Guns arrived after the confession was already complete. Gunpowder gets the credit because it makes a better story. An explosion is visible. A design admission is not. A musket volley has a sound. A swordsmith grinding the edge off his own blade and calling it progress makes no sound at all. But that silence is where the actual history lives, not in the moment the musket fired. In the moment the craftsman picked up the grindstone and started removing what 3,000 years of tradition had put there. That was the ending. Everything after was just the world catching up to what the workshops already knew.